From a quick military action to a long-term oil operation, ahead on Face the State. U.S. involvement in Venezuela now shifts to seizing and selling oil. Forces just seized a sixth tanker as President Trump meets with the country's opposition leader. This morning, political science professor Nicole Califf-Hughes joins me to discuss the U.S.'s role in the country and where it goes from here. Also, the Trump administration is ending legal protections for some Somalis, meaning they could be deported. We look at just how many in Columbus's large Somali community could be affected and where this will likely end up. Plus, starting over, a group pushing to block Ohio's new recreational marijuana and hemp law hits a speed bump. What they have to do now to put a measure on the ballot with a deadline looming. Thanks for joining us for Face the State. I'm Doug Petcash. We start today with a focus on U.S. involvement in Venezuela. The main headlines surrounding Venezuela now have to do with oil seizures and oil sales. A Trump administration official said the first U.S. sale of Venezuelan oil has been completed, and it's estimated to be worth $500 million. The official says more sales are expected in the coming days and weeks. U.S. leaders have said oil sales will benefit the people of Venezuela. U.S. Southern Command released this video showing U.S. forces seizing a sixth oil tanker in the Caribbean, part of the ongoing quarantine of sanctioned oil going in and out of Venezuela. Meanwhile, President Trump met with Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado at the White House Thursday. She presented him with her Nobel Peace Prize medal, seen as an offering to win his support. He also signaled relations are warming with Venezuela's acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, seen here. She was Nicolas Maduro's vice president. Earlier this month, U.S. forces captured former Venezuelan President Maduro and his wife in a surprise overnight operation. Maduro now faces drug trafficking and other charges in the U.S. Ohio Republican Senator John Husted says the U.S. operation in Venezuela was a well-planned, well-executed mission in which troops were on the ground for a short time. Husted says he does not support sending troops to Venezuela going forward.
There are no troops on the ground. And I don't want any troops on the ground. And if there are to be any troops on the ground, that would need to come back to Congress for approval. But right now, it's being successfully, the temporary administration in Venezuela is cooperating with the Trump administration. They're going to sell Venezuelan oil on the open market. And the Trump administration is making sure that that money goes for the benefit of the Venezuelan people and not for this regime that has been so brutal over the years, or the remnants of it. And so far, it's being executed well. The people of Venezuela around the world and in Venezuela seem to be very supportive of it, but I'm not in favor of committing U.S. troops to any operation in Venezuela.
Former longtime Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown is running against Senator Husted in the November election. As I reported last week, Brown released a statement on the Trump administration saying the U.S. will run Venezuela. In relation to that, Brown said hundreds of thousands of Ohioans are struggling to make ends meet, yet Washington continues to make their lives harder while prioritizing foreign countries before our own. Ohioans are facing higher costs across the board and are desperate for leadership that will help deliver relief. We should be more focused on improving the lives of Ohioans, not Caracas. I talked with Bowling Green State University political science professor Dr. Nicole Califf-Hughes for perspective on U.S. involvement in Venezuela over the years and how it got to where it is today. She says it dates back decades with Venezuela's oil industry and the changing of leadership of the country. Professor Califf-Hughes and I talked about that, what's happening now, and what comes next.
When you hear discussion today about taking back what's ours refers to international companies like Exxon taking back essentially the investment that they lost in Venezuela when Venezuela nationalized the oil industry. Venezuela nationalizes the oil industry in the late 90s, early 2000s. They start using all that money to support the population, which is great as long as the money keeps coming in and oil prices stay high. When oil prices dip, you lose that money, you lose that resource, and there's nothing else to take its place. And you combine that with leaders of Venezuela bringing in not experts so much as their friends, and you end up with a lot of corruption, a lot of economic uncertainty, and a lot of poverty for everyone in Venezuela, with the exception of the elite ruling class. And that's essentially how kind of we got to this point. Venezuela and the US have kind of feuded over this for a really long time. Because a lot of these companies are American companies that lost some of their investment when Venezuela nationalized the oil industry. And as the economy crumbled, you started having more opportunistic political leaders step in. And that's kind of where we are right now. Maduro took over from Chavez, again, runs on this idea of keeping profits in Venezuela, and was not successful at keeping the economy stable.
So was this about oil and not about a law enforcement thing with, drugs and weapons that they arrested Maduro for?
Well, there is indeed an indictment for Maduro, focusing on drugs, and we'll have to see how that plays out in the courts. Right, an indictment isn't necessarily an indicator of guilt. He'll have to go through a trial in the regular American legal process. But based on everything that's happened since the arrest of Maduro and his wife, it's oil. It all goes back to oil. And it's kind of like the same old song with a slightly different tune. Everything the US has done since his capture doesn't really have anything to do with stemming flows of drugs, because there's very little evidence from US intelligence that Maduro had anything to do with large scale drug trafficking. It's oil. It's always oil. And we tend to really focus on that throughout history, at least in the recent past.
Leaders I've talked to here in the U.S. have said that the proceeds from the Venezuelan oil will be used to benefit the Venezuelan people. Is that how you see it playing out?
We don't know. And so you've seen President Trump has posted on social media that he's like the acting president of Venezuela, and comments to that effect, which isn't necessarily true. Marco Rubio has tried to kind of walk those back and said that we're actually going to be in charge of Venezuelan oil and oil profits, and we will use that to better the situation in Venezuela for Venezuelans. We don't know how that's going to play out. We don't have an infrastructure for that. We don't necessarily have a way to set that up yet. And they could come up with something, but how do you get there? How do you get that money back to the people? Because right now, the way Venezuela is set up and has been set up, the people who are benefiting from any oil revenue are the elites. It is not going down to the average Venezuelan. It's not going down to the public in really any meaningful way. It's not improving schools or healthcare or anything like that. So we don't necessarily have a way to do that. And because the government that is in power is essentially Maduro's government, it's his vice president is in charge. We don't really have any clear plans for those changes yet that have come out. We can say this, but it's a lot easier to say we're going to do it than actually act on it. The other problem with that is actually the cost of oil. Oil is not super high right now. It's not tremendously expensive. And Trump actually campaigned on lowering the price of oil. So if you lower the price of oil, that's actually less money to send back to Venezuela. And that's not even touching on the infrastructure to actually extract the oil in Venezuela, which is a whole separate can of worms.
You mentioned that Maduro's vice president is now running is in charge of the government there. But the United States has talked about us running Venezuela. What is happening? Is there a power vacuum and the stability or instability right now in the country?
I would say it's instability. I think you could argue that there is a power vacuum. There have long been different competing factions in Venezuela, with the opposition party that broadly it's agreed actually won the last presidential election, and Maduro just said no and stayed president. There's been a lot of competing factions in Venezuela. There are armed groups in Venezuela. The situation has been very unstable there for a long time. And us, as in America, running Venezuela is mostly us expressing our preferences and kind of threatening the use of military force, but we don't have a clear structure for that to happen. Everyone in power in Venezuela right now is still Maduro's government. And so we can threaten, but we don't have like a clear lever of government to make those types of changes.
What's the political fallout here in terms of how this will impact our leaders or future actions?
This is actually really interesting. If you look at public opinion polls, because we've kind of been amassing military off the coast of Venezuela since the fall, if you look at public opinion from December about whether Americans believe the U.S. should intervene militarily in Venezuela, it was actually really low across the board for both Democrats and Republicans. After January 3rd, when we took Maduro and his wife, Republican support for military intervention in Venezuela went way up. Democrats still stayed pretty low, right around 13%. Republicans went up to about 70%. But the average American, if you're looking at the aggregate, does not really support military intervention in Venezuela. We don't love the idea broadly in the aggregate of getting involved in another long conflict. We don't love the idea of troops on the ground in another country without really an express purpose. So the administration is having to kind of walk a fine line between what the American public is willing to support and what they're not. There was some really interesting pushback in Congress, but that seems to, even among Republicans, but that seems to have died off in the last day.
So finally, where does this go from here?
The most unsatisfying answer is we don't know. Right now, the administration is trying to convince oil companies to reinvest in Venezuela. So far, the response has been a pretty hard pass. So they're going to start pressuring oil companies to go back and reinvest in Venezuela, which is going to be risky for the oil companies. For the U.S., we're using this as a threat to Cuba, as a threat to Colombia, and to a lesser extent as a threat to Greenland for U.S. involvement abroad, and increasing U.S. involvement both in terms of regime change and in terms of just taking over other locations. But again, there's very little public support for that right now among the American population across both parties for military involvement abroad. And so it's going to be tricky, I think, for the administration to balance pressure from the Republican Party, pressure from the Democratic Party, and kind of what the Americans are willing to support. Because if we're sending a bunch of U.S. tax dollars, like taxpayer dollars, to another country, there needs to be kind of something credible in return that the American public is getting. And right now, we're just not seeing that yet.
And that was Bowling Green State University political science professor Nicole Califf-Hughes. Still ahead on Face the State, the Trump administration is ending temporary protected status for Somalis in the U.S. It affects a small number of immigrants, but one state leader says it still has a big impact. Hear from him. And a group is back to square one in its effort to repeal Ohio's new recreational marijuana and hemp law. We'll explain the ruling that has them starting over and what they have to do now to get a referendum on the ballot. Welcome back to Face the State. The deputy director of ICE is resigning so she can run for Congress in Northwest Ohio. Madison Sheehan posted this campaign video Thursday on social media announcing her intention to run for Ohio's 9th District congressional seat. According to the 28-year-old's bio on ICE's website, she's an OSU grad and was a member of the women's rowing team. Sheehan is running for the seat held by Democrat Marcy Kaptur. Kaptur is the longest-serving woman in the history of Congress in office since 1982. The Trump administration announced it is ending protected status for some Somali immigrants, making them eligible to be deported. It comes in the wake of allegations of daycare fraud and ICE operations in Minnesota, and it impacts some people in Columbus's Somali community. I talked with State Representative Ishmael Muhammad, who is a Somali-American U.S. citizen. He says the order impacts a small sliver of Columbus's Somali community, but it's troubling.
It's very much concerning what the President Trump has said, and this is something that's been hinting for some time now. The threats he's been making to obviously directed at the Somali community has been very concerning. But now he's following it up with an actual policy impact.
The Trump administration is terminating Somalia's Temporary Protected Status Program, or TPS. That means Somali nationals enrolled in the program will lose their legal status and work permits on March 17th. State Representative Ishmael Muhammad of Columbus is a criminal and immigration attorney.
the number of folks that have come up to me who said I'm under TPS are a small percentage. So I would be surprised if it's more than, maybe 100 or 150.
The U.S. Census Bureau's 2024 American Community Survey estimates about 260,000 people of Somali descent live in the U.S., and 83% of them are U.S. citizens. Columbus City leaders estimate the Somali population here at 60,000. The number of those in the U.S. under TPS, though, is small. Estimates range from 705 from the National Immigration Forum to 2,500 from the Department of Homeland Security. I asked Senator John Husted if he agreed or disagreed with the administration's order ending TPS shortly after it ccame down Tuesday morning.
This is a tiny part of the population that would be affected by it, and it does not seem like it doesn't seem like it's going to be problematic.
The Department of Homeland Security can designate a foreign country for temporary protected status if conditions there are unsafe to return. Those include an ongoing armed conflict, environmental disaster such as an earthquake or hurricane, an epidemic or other emergency. Many Somalis fled civil war. Representative Mohammed doesn't believe conditions there are safe for people to return.
When it comes to attacks, when it comes to instability, political instability, it has had a lot of issues.
Representative Mohammed says he hopes the order is challenged in court. Another immigration attorney I talked to said a court challenge is likely. He said he's not sure any reasonable person would say Somalia is a safe place. Well, after a setback, an Ohio group is pushing forward with its effort to block Ohio's new recreational marijuana and hemp law. On Tuesday, Attorney General Dave Yost rejected the summary language for a proposed referendum to repeal Senate Bill 56. In a letter to Ohioans for Cannabis Choice, Yost wrote, "Upon review of the summary, we identified omissions and misstatements that, as a whole, would mislead a potential signer as to the scope and effect of SB 56. Now, Senate Bill 56 requires intoxicating hemp products to be sold only at licensed dispensaries. The law Governor DeWine signed also bans THC beverages. It also makes changes to recreational marijuana regulations. For example, it prohibits people from buying marijuana in another state and bringing it to Ohio, and limits home grow to 6 plants, among other stipulations. Ohioans for Cannabis Choice calls Yost's ruling a speed bump and says they're pushing on to try to stop the law from taking effect. Now they have to start from scratch.
The politicians in Columbus do not like the fact that in 2023 voters said cannabis should be legal in Ohio. They don't like that. And so what they're doing is they're trying to undermine the will of the people with government overreach. We think voters will, we see this already. As soon as we started to put this campaign together, we've had hundreds of people reach out to us and say, how do I sign this? How do I get involved? How do I make sure that voters can take this law off the books? If we collect these signatures, this law will go on pause. I mean, we'll hit a big pause button. This law does not go into effect until the voters say what they want to do in November.
Ohioans for Cannabis Choice must now regather 1,000 signatures to resubmit the petition to the Secretary of State and Attorney General. If those two agencies certify the petition, Ohioans for Cannabis Choice will then need to collect and submit about 250,000 valid voter signatures from 44 of Ohio's 88 counties to the Secretary of State by mid-March to get the referendum on the November 2026 ballot. That number represents 6% of the vote in the most recent gubernatorial election. Meantime, the grassroots group Ohio Equal Rights officially launched its statewide signature collection campaign Wednesday. They aim to put 2 proposed constitutional amendments on the November ballot. The Ohio Equal Rights Amendment would add anti-discrimination protections to the state constitution. Those include protections for race, religion, sexual orientation, disability, recovery status, and several others. Protections would apply to housing, education, health care, and employment. The Right to Marry Amendment calls for the repeal of Ohio's constitutional ban on same-sex marriage. Right now, the state constitution defines marriage as only between one man and one woman. Ohio Equal Rights has to collect more than 440,000 valid voter signatures for each proposed amendment by July 1st to get these measures on the November ballot. Governor Mike DeWine is pushing to make Ohio the next training location for the U.S. Coast Guard. The governor wrote a letter to Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. In it, he mentions Cleveland already serves as home to the Coast Guard's Great Lakes headquarters, which supports 6,000 Coast Guard members. The governor suggests the former site of Urbana University as a ready-made facility for the training location. In part, DeWine says it's his vision that Ohio be the most military-friendly state in the nation. He also said Jobs Ohio is willing to provide the Coast Guard with grants and incentives and other assistance to make that Urbana site work. Still ahead on Face the State, the back and forth over your electric bill. AEP Ohio says you'll see a drop in your bill if their settlement is approved, but a consumer advocacy agency takes issue with the electric company's math. We'll break down what both sides are saying next. American Electric Power of Ohio announced a settlement agreement that they say will cut customers' electric bills by $58.7 million. That would translate to a reduction in your bill of about $1.22 a month. But a state agency that represents utility consumers says AEP's math doesn't add up.
I think they're too high. I think they've been too high. We've had a lot of outages.
Many Ohioans are keeping close tabs on their electric bills. Andrew Rydell helps his mom pay hers.
Yeah, it's pretty steep. I pay about close to $200 every month. Yeah.
Ray Cantu added solar panels.
Really just looking to save wherever we can, and people were going door to door. It was a good option for us.
AEP Ohio announced a settlement agreement it says will decrease customers' bills by $1.22 a month for 18 months. In a statement, AEP Ohio President and Chief Operating Officer Mark Reiter said, in part, this settlement balances the need to invest in electric distribution infrastructure to provide reliable electricity with the need to keep electric rates as low as possible. But the Ohio Consumers Council says AEP used, quote, accounting gimmicks to come up with the decrease.
And over on this side is what we think the real bill will look like.
Agency Director Maureen Willis showed me the figures. The OCC produced this bar graph showing a more than $30 per month increase in bills when add-ons or riders are considered. Riders pay for tree trimming and line maintenance and improvements to electric distribution equipment such as poles, wires, and transformers.
We think it's a misleading announcement because consumers, it has been billed as consumers seeing a rate decrease, seeing their bills decrease, when in fact consumers' bills will increase when you consider the added rider charges that AEP is not addressing.
AEP Ohio denied our request for an interview but provided statements and information by email. The company says it strongly disagrees with the characterization that this settlement relies on accounting gimmicks or results in a hidden rate increase. AEP Ohio sent 10 TV this graph showing its calculations, including a rider rate decrease by moving from riders to base rates and for a required consumer credit for a decrease of that $1.22 per month. AEP says we can control the base rate customers pay for distribution because we are accountable for the cost of service. Ohio law prevents us from generating power to fix the imbalance between supply and demand for power, which is driving up costs. Meanwhile, Columbus Stand Up is gathering petition signatures to present to the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, urging it to reject AEP's settlement agreement.
PUCO has a mandate to balance interests and look out for the public's interests in these cases, and we think that they should reject AEP's request and the settlement because they will all increase electricity prices.
The Public Utilities Commission of Ohio will have the final say. The PUCO will have a hearing on the settlement starting on January 21st. A spokesperson says it will last about 2 weeks. Well, thank you for joining me this week for Face the State. I'm Doug Petcash. I'll see you back here next Sunday at 11:30. I hope you have a great day.